Hey, good morning. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, a division of Braun Intertech, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on spill response. Not all spills are the same. Our expert for today is W&M's Austin Hyder from in our beautiful Houston office, and that's where we're broadcasting today. So, hello, Austin. Welcome.
Good morning, Lance.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. It's cooler in here than it is outside.
Yes, it is. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me through your chat tab on your GoToWebinar windows. If we don't get to your questions, I will make sure Austin sees them and we will get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon along with the slides. I will send you an email with the link when they are made available. So let's get to it. And I understand that I guess our mics were live before I started the broadcast. I don't even understand that. So if you heard, I don't think we say anything too inappropriate, but that's my bad. So I'm going to introduce Austin to us. Austin is an environmental geoscience graduate from Texas A&M. He is an Aggie, and he wanted to make sure that he put his logo on his picture because that's what all Aggies do. So good job, Austin. Okay. His experience includes multi-spill response and remediation projects, and he's the associate principal and division manager in W&M's Houston office. So did I miss anything? Do you want to add anything to that?
You got it.
All right. Well, let's get to it. So, all right, Austin, there's a difference between emergency response and spill response. What is the difference between the two?
Sure. Yeah. The emergency is the initial 24 hours. So let's say we have a spill, we have a release or a discharge, and we've identified that. That's the emergency situation. And you start the response phase. And so the emergency response is typically from the initial point of identification to within about the first 24 hours. Within those first 24 hours, you should identify, control, contain, and hopefully stop that spill release. From that point, you move more into the spill response phase. So that's the assessment, cleanup, remediation, and then further down the road, closure. So that transition can happen relatively quick. It can take a little bit longer than 24 hours, maybe more towards 48 hours up to 2 or 3 days. But, it's typically the emergency first 24 and then the spill response 48-hour crew is kind of how I like to identify it.
Okay, so the emergency response would be if I had a glass full of water and it knocked over and of course the water spilled. The emergency response would be to pick the glass up so it would stop spilling if you can, and then get some, for lack of better word, get some paper towels and clean up the response. That would be the emergency response to keep it from spreading. Correct?
Right. Stop the source.
Yeah.
Contain the spill area, and then you assess. So the emergency is the tip it over, pick it back up, contain it, and stop it.
Yeah. So if it was water, my paper towels would be fine. If it was something other than that, we might need to get the Clorox or something to get it to that would be the spill response, like what we need to do after the initial.
Right. The paper towels can only absorb so much, and then so you get into the spill response where you actually need to further clean up.
And so everybody knows we're not going to be talking about paper towels and spills going forward. I just want to put that hypothetical. That's what we're talking about between the difference. Okay. So who do we contact? So do we have to contact? Who do we contact?
Absolutely. So, in an emergency situation, spill, discharge, release to air, we need to contact the state and the federal hotlines. And so each state is going to be dependent on a certain hotline. And so we're a Texas-based, W&M's Texas-based as far as locale, but we stretch out and provide services for a couple other different adjacent states and, across the U.S. But for this specific webinar, we will be talking about Texas regulations. And so the state hotline that is provided here is just for quick reference. If you have a spill, if it's a reportable quantity, and you need to note the proper federal and state agencies, that number's here. It's provided for you. So you have the National Spill Response Center for federal reporting, and then you also have the Texas Spill Reporting Hotline for the state. One thing that may get overlooked at times is the Texas 811. If you have an emergency situation where you have a spill into a creek and you want to contain that, you want to start digging up some material before it spreads any further, you need to put in an emergency response ticket, an 811, a utility locate ticket. Are there underground utilities in the area that you're going to be digging? In this instance, a typical one call ticket is good after 48 hours of submittal. An emergency response ticket kicks in immediately after notification.
Okay, and we already have a question from the audience, so I'm going to really quick. So are there reporting thresholds, and what are they? Are we going to get into that?
We are going to get into that. Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll get into that. So we don't, we'll go back up to this question in a little while. So really quick, so if somebody is in another state and they need to know if their state has a call center, you can help them with at least try to locate who
Absolutely.
that would be. So
Right.
if there's anybody out there who's wondering that, we can help them with that.
So regulatory agency's jurisdiction, who is responsible? Who are you going to report to, and who is going to be over the jurisdiction of your spill? So it could be dependent. It's definitely case by case. The spill rules are regulated by TCEQ. They are the state's lead agency. They're in charge of spills of hazardous substances as well as refined crude product. They are not in charge of spills in coastal waterways or in charge of unrefined crude product. So you'll see a couple logos here. So TCEQ, Railroad Commission of Texas. The Railroad Commission has a jurisdiction of spills or discharges associated with exploration and production activities. So the unrefined crude process, pipeline transportation, oil, gas, and geothermal resources. This doesn't include highway transportation of refined product. So the difference there is unrefined, it hasn't been touched, it's coming out of the ground, hasn't gone through a treatment process. The refined product is regulated by TCEQ. So unrefined, Railroad Commission, refined, TCEQ. We've also got the General Land Office, who's in charge of oil spills and coastal waters. You have the Texas Park and Wildlife Department that their primary focus is on wildlife resources, so fish, wildlife losses and kills, populations. Texas Department of State Health Services typically look at threats to human health by biological, chemical hazards. And then Department of Public Safety, Texas DPS. They secure transportation along roadways related to spills and incidents. You'll see a lot of local news. You'll see trucks turned over, and you have a hazmat crew that responds. So the DPS kicks in there. They help out with identifying the placards on the trucks, what manifests in the truck, what kind of chemical they're dealing with, and handle that situation.
Okay, I have to ask really quick. Why is the Railroad Commission in charge of oil spills?
So back in the day when we didn't have pipelines, we transported crude by rail. So
Correct.
You had the jurisdiction. There's the Railroad Commission transported crude by rail. Now, what's more efficient, cost effective, transporting crude via pipeline. The name has stuck. Railroad Commission of Texas in charge of the unrefined crude process.
But they don't have anything to do with railroads?
Correct.
That's weird. Okay, good. All right, so hopefully you guys got a little bit out of this, at least a little trivia question. So I did at least. So reportable quantities.
It was asked, and
all right, here we go.
We're talking about it. So 40 CFR 302.4 is your list of EPA hazardous substances and their associated reportable quantities. So there's a citation there. Table 302 has your final reportable quantities for EPA identified hazardous substances. So it's the table of tables. It gives you everything you need to know about the type of chemical and its volume or reportable quantity that will trigger that notification, that will trigger that spill response, further reporting, remediation.
Okay. I feel like we need to go into a little bit deeper, but I think you did a pretty good job. So, okay, so we're going to be planning for success. So the planning of this is if you have some of these chemicals, tanks, anything in there, you need to come to the realization you are going to have a spill. Is that, you don't want it, but it would be probably good to say somewhere down the line, we're going to have a spill.
The inevitable will happen.
Yeah.
At the wrong place and the wrong time, it's going to happen. And so whether your facility's been operating for 5 years or 25 years, that scenario can occur by human error. It can occur by improper replacement of parts, equipments, just general oversight. So you need to be prepared in case it does occur.
Because there's never a convenient spill or a planned spill. So, right. So by definition, a spill is, a surprise. So
we want to plan for success. We don't want to plan for failure.
Yeah, you're not going to know tomorrow I'm going to have a spill or so. Okay. So here are the 5 steps. So take it away.
Yeah. So preparation is key. So, we want to prepare. We want to be able to get ahead of a situation that might get out of control. And so if we can prepare for a potential release or spill, we'll slow down, we'll speed up the process rather than have to worry about long-term liability. So when we prepare, we can succeed. As something happens, and it finally does happen, when that spill unfortunately happens on Christmas Eve and you have limited staff, you have people in place that can identify, the spill, understand the process that goes into a response. And so if you're prepared, identifying and controlling that spill becomes a lot more efficient. And then further down the line, once we've controlled that spill and we've contained it, we've stopped it, we're going to assess the situation. Where is it? How deep is it? Is it in the soil? Is it in the water? Is it in the nearby surface water body? And we're going to vertically and horizontally identify those conditions and those medias, and then we're going to remediate. So once we've identified the extent, we can clean up that soil. We can clean up the groundwater. We can remove the source, and then we can further close out the site with reporting and with our state agencies. Preparation. So got a couple of pictures here. Safety data sheets, a spill kit, some absorbents, boom, and gloves and PPE. So we talked about being prepared, getting ahead of the game. So we want to make sure that our day-to-day operations, folks on a facility, whether it's a manufacturing facility, industrial facility, commercial facility, that they're trained and certified. They're prepared for that spill to occur. And how do you do that? There's a lot of steps in the process. And so a couple things that we'll talk about here is, the preparation on site. Do you have proper spill kits? Do your employees have proper equipment? Do they have proper PPE? Do they know what PPE they need to have? And so safety data sheets will kind of give you some of that information. They'll provide you, do you need a certain type of glove to handle this chemical? Do you need a certain type of, do you need goggles, or do you need safety glasses? And so safety data sheets are extremely important because it's an inventory of the types of materials that you store or use on site. And those safety data sheets are important because it tells you the required PPE to handle that material. It will also tell you the reportable quantities and the chemicals that make up that material. So that table that we cited previously is great, but a lot of these safety data sheets will also have that information provided on them. And so your on-site staff can only do so much. They're not contractors who specialize in environmental work. They know the day-to-day operations. They know how to shut off a valve and stop a situation, but do they know how to clean up a situation? Do they know how to get out there and respond and handle that media? And so most of our clients tend to have approved and established contractors and consultants. And so, the contractors can be your heavy machinery operators, people who help out with roll-off box rentals and yellow iron, so digging out of soil, backhoe, excavator. And then consultants like W&M. We provide the environmental specialty. We know how to properly sample. We know how to properly identify chemicals. We use the proper jars, the proper procedures to collect those samples. And so typically those contractors are validated. We know that they have proper insurance to perform those types of operations. They have the certifications and trainings. They have the proper personnel with experience, and they have the right equipment.
Okay.
The big thing is response time.
And we're not talking about emergency response. We're talking about spill response. So we're talking about
a little
afterwards.
bit, bit of both
okay.
here. So the contractors can be your emergency and your spill response.
Okay.
And so we want to identify both because you have to have that emergency contractor to stop and control the situation. And then you want to move them kind of out and then get into the spill phase where you don't have as much site activity going on. You want to assess and delineate.
Okay, so in most of these cases that you've seen where if people know that they were part of that reportable spill, that they don't really usually have people on staff that can clean. So they need somebody else, an outside source, to come in and do that. So we don't do, W&M doesn't do that, or do we dabble in that, or does it depend? Or
so it'll depend. And so most sites will have an environmental health and safety representative that understands the process, and they've built a plan, and they have a plan in place to mitigate this issue. They likely can't take everything on themselves. Some of them will try and internally perform some of this operation, but some of them will sub out to established vendors and contractors, and that's kind of where the spill response consultant will come in and take over.
Okay.
So in preparation, there are certain things that your facility may be required to have, and a lot of facilities will have a spill preparedness plan in place, and some facilities are going to be required to have a spill prevention control and countermeasure plan, SPCC plan in place. And so, what does that mean? Well, if you have an SPCC plan, it's because you have more than 1,320 gallons of aggregate volume of a storage of oil, above ground storage of oil. And we're not talking 5-gallon buckets. We're talking 55-gallon size containers, drums, or larger. So you'll see those above ground storage tanks, 55-gallon drums lying around. So if they have a cumulative volume greater than or equal to 1,320 gallons, they're required to have an SPCC plan.
Okay, so if I have 55-gallon drums, if it's equal to 1,000
320 gallons or greater.
Okay.
Absolutely required of containing oil. Okay. Oil-based substance.
Okay.
You could also potentially be required to have an SPCC plan if you have below ground storage equal to or greater than 42,000 gallons of oil, with potential reasonable chance to discharge into navigable water body or adjoining shorelines. So we tend to think about above ground storage tanks, but there also is sometimes the applicability for an underground storage tank. Like I said, greater than or equal to 42,000 gallons to be required to have an SPCC
That's
plan.
pretty big. It's a pretty big tank.
It can be 3 or 4 tanks. Doesn't have to be one tank.
Okay.
It's cumulative volume.
Okay, cumulative. Okay.
Yeah. And so we also have facility response plan on here. I'm not going to touch too much on it, but during the SPCC development, you will identify through the substantial harm checklist whether your facility may also be required to have an FRP plan. So when you formulate that SPCC plan, you'll further identify whether an FRP is applicable or not. And there are a couple different reasons that you would apply. You would be required to obtain and have an FRP plan, but I'm not going to get into that today.
Okay.
And in preparation, so you asked about the process itself. So desktops and live drills are great. If you want to prepare for a spill, you want to prepare and be on top of it, you want to get your contractors and your consultants involved in the process. And so how do we do that? We perform a desktop mock drill. We have a spill. Everybody in the room is responsible for a certain part of the process, and you play out a spill as if it started to a certain phase to where you stop. And so it can be a 4-hour drill, it can be an 8-hour drill. Sometimes it gets the local emergency contacts involved. You're going to call the fire department. You're going to call the police department. You're going to call hazmat team. Those facilities that you identify that you need to report to in case something occurs. And live drill. So sometimes you will actually get out in the facility. You'll put boom out. You'll pretend like you're cleaning up a spill and actually performing those activities. So when that spill does occur, you're prepared. You're ready to go.
Okay, so you said we're going to go back to the 55-gallon drum thing for 1,300 cumulative gallons. Now, is that you said oil-based? But what about hazardous, dangerous chemicals? I mean,
if it falls within the definition, it's going to be required. And so
not just oil; it can be
vegetable oil, not just gasoline, diesel.
I'm talking about chemicals or no? Okay. So let's move on then. Okay, identification and control.
Yep. So we've prepared. Now we're moving into the spill occurred, and so there's a lot of documentation that needs to be maintained, and you need to have proper documentation throughout the process of the spill. So when it occurs, we need to know the date and the time. I know it sounds silly, but it's going back to elementary. We want to know who, what, when, where, why, and how. Those things are very important when we're sending a report to the state. We formulate a chronology of events from the start, identification, all the way to the last step of the process. So things that we want to document are date and time. We want to know the chemical that was spilled, released. Where did that spill release occur? Do we have that supporting SDS? We should. It should be on site. So we should know what kind of chemicals we're dealing with and how we need to handle them. What PPE is required to handle those? What's the reportable quantity? We have to make our best guess in the field for the quantity and the duration of that spill. If it happened at midnight, we didn't identify it till 4 o'clock. We just need to make our best determination an estimation on visual observation. So can be difficult at times. And the location of the spill, what media was affected? Soil, potentially groundwater, potentially surface water, sediments. We need to make that determination, identify it. And then if we have water threatened, it becomes a significant issue because we have a ditch, it goes into a ditch that goes into a channel that could potentially go further downstream. So we need to put those booms out. We need to control it and contain it.
Okay.
Continuing on, so responsible party. Who's the company that was in charge of the spill? Name, address, phone number. Also like to document the person that identified the spill on site. Who was it? What's their role in the process?
Or who caused it.
Or who potentially caused it. Don't want to call anybody out, but we need to have that for documentation. Okay. Hazards to the environment. We talked about a little bit about that just a second ago. Air, soil, water, wildlife, human health. You could have one of those apply. You could have all of them apply. So we need to identify what impacts there are to the environment and what medias are affected. Extent of injuries. With somebody turning a valve and broke the wrench, and the wrench caused them to fall back, hurt their arm, and then we have a spill occur. Mm-hmm. We need to note that type of information. It's obviously important for internal reporting, liabilities, insurance, but it's also a part of the documentation process that's required for the state. And then steps to control and contain. Obviously, we want to stop it. So the first thing we want to do is find a way to stop it. Is there emergency shutoff valve control that's in place that we can turn on, turn off, press a button, or is it a manual process? And if we have a spill that's occurring, we need to contain it. So ways to contain it: absorbents. We have booms. And then we can also store some of this material. So if we know it's spreading across the soil, we can provide some roll-off boxes and start digging this stuff up and putting it into a roll-off box. And we'll talk further about waste, but that's, we're going to generate a waste and we need to profile that and know what we need to do with it. And then regulatory notification. This is obviously all happening very early in the process. First 24 hours, getting all this information formulated, documented, but we need to make sure we're notifying the proper regulatory agency. Mm-hmm. And we need to know how we traverse that process. How do we go down it? What assessment and remediation process do we need to take? Is it specific to Railroad Commission or is it specific to TCQ spill rules?
Okay, so I have a question. So have you had any, in your experience, have you had any late responses that there might have been a spill that happened? We had a spill a couple weeks ago. We did our best to, we did our emergency response, but now we're thinking we probably should have had somebody else come in here. Have you ever had that happen?
I'd like to tell you, no, they clean it up immediately. Yeah. However, yes, we've had it happen. And, I've seen it as far out about a week.
And I guess it's better than nothing, right? I mean, you want it to be as soon as it happened, but it's better that at some point.
Right. And the good thing is all the times that we've been notified a week, maybe a couple of days or a week late, it's that they have reported it. They know it's a reportable quantity, and they've made their attempt at, identifying the extent of it. But they get in there, they start digging, they realize it's a much larger issue than they initially thought. And then they bring us in, and we help, smooth the process out. So sometimes usually when that happens is they're trying to do everything themselves. They don't have that specialized knowledge and experience, and then they're asking for help.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever had an experience where you've found out that they've had a spill much later? They didn't tell anybody. It's like, yeah, you had some kind of a spill here. And they're like, yeah, well, oh yeah, we didn't know we had to report it.
Again, I'd like to tell you no.
Okay. So it just makes it harder. And
it definitely makes it harder.
And are you allowed to,
those are typically sites that you're going to see that have to actually go further past. We're past the spill stage.
Right.
It's a historic release.
Yes.
We're going into a regulatory program. We're required to clean up. We're moving on. So at that point, it's maybe a historical spill that was overlooked. Let's say a gas station back in 1950s that was operating for 20 years. They sold the place. The new owner had no clue about it, and that tank was still sitting there. Well, over time, it's going to have issues. Mm-hmm. It's going to have may have a hole in it. It might degrade. And then so somebody comes in, wants to buy the property, and they perform their due diligence and find out, oh, wow, there's a storage tank.
So at that point,
here.
It's not spill response, it's remediation.
Right, absolutely.
Okay.
So we've identified the spill, we've controlled the spill, and we've stopped it. So where do we go from here? And so I'm going to kind of follow down two paths. We've talked about the TCQ and the Railroad Commission of Texas, and so we're going to talk about TCQ right here, and the next slide will be about Railroad Commission. So TCQ has established spill rules in 30 TAC 327, and there's a lot of information there. I'll try and sum it up in a short, simplified version here. But you have, from the initial notification to the first 30 days, you have the ability to remediate, clean up to background or pre-existing conditions. And so what does that mean? Pre-existing conditions could mean that we have a site that we closed back 20, 30 years ago. It was a spill, we've cleaned it up, or it was it was enrolled in a TCQ project and it closed under certain conditions. We have a spill that occurred, we identify the state, and we want to clean up to those pre-existing conditions. So they've been established and approved in the past, and we're cleaning up to that. Or we're cleaning up to background. Background means that it's non-detect. So it wasn't there to begin with. We need to make sure it's no longer there. So we clean up to non-detectable levels with what's non-detect is based off of laboratory analysis. So for instance, we're going to talk about chemicals of concern. So we need to, when we have a spill, we want to know what type of chemicals we discharged or we spilled. And so identifying that is key to understanding what we're going to sample, why we're going to sample. So we identify the chemicals, we sample and delineate horizontally, vertically. We've discussed this, and the affected media. So likely it's going to be on top of soil, could potentially be in the underlying groundwater. So we want to know where and what types of media. And we also want to know how we're going to sample. We need to implement adequate sampling procedures. And so new methods, one I like to bring up is the EPA 5035 method for volatile organic compounds and total petroleum hydrocarbons. So you'll see a little picture down the bottom. It's the TerraCore kit that we're all used to now. Used to be a bulk jar. Now it's these 5-gram aliquots that we collect and put in these preserved VOAs. So make sure you're using this proper sampling procedure and methods, because it could be an issue further down the road if you're not.
Okay, so sampling, is it required that they have an environmental consultant do the sampling, or is it preferred?
It would be preferred. I talked about it previously that some companies will have in-house, environmental health and safety representatives, and sometimes they will try and do that work. However, a consultant like ourselves, we specialize in this type of work. We understand the sampling process. We understand the analytical components that go with it, and we're able to come in and do it in a more efficient, effective.
Right. Because if you don't get an accurate sample, then the data is going to come back all. You can't be accurate on the data. And
so to give you an example, Lance, I've been out to a site where they had a spill, and I'm presented a water bottle full of water from the spill site, and it's not the proper sampling container. So those are the things that when we come in, we understand that process.
Okay.
That water bottle is not going to be what we send to the lab. We need to put it in a proper container. We need to make sure it's packed properly.
And you can't take that sample from the water bottle because you don't know how it was.
Correct. So we'll want to go actually get
the
proper representative sample.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we talked about the 30 days. So you have 30 days to remediate to background or pre-existing conditions. If that does not occur, you can request an extension for up to 180 days. So you have the initial 30 and an additional 150. So a total of 180 days. If you are not remediated at that point, you're going to go into TCQ enrollment within the corrective action division.
So in your expertise, when you have a spill, I mean, how often can it be remediated in 30 days? That seems a short window.
Small spills I've seen cleaned up in 30 days. 50, 60% can be cleaned up within 30 days if they're relatively small. If they're just on maybe the surface of the soil, they respond quickly, they're prepared, they can turn it around. Okay. 180 days, you tend to see the majority of your projects probably extend out to that 180-day period. I've seen one or two very large-scale projects that weren't cleaned up within that 180 days, and they actually go into regulatory enrollment. So you can see about a 90% success rate within those first 180 days.
And what's the ratio? I mean, if you 30 days to 180 days, I mean, obviously it just spent.
So I'd probably say, we get about 30, 40% within the first 30. You get 50% there, and then, 10, 20% depending on your 30-day cleanup for enrollment.
I think we.
Nope.
Okay, we're ready. Okay, sorry.
There you go. So now we're going to talk about Railroad Commission. So very similar to the TCQ and certain processes here. So Railroad Commission has established statewide rules 820 and 91 that define spill cleanup for a Railroad Commission facility or site. And so again, we want to identify the chemicals of concern. With railroad commissions, we're talking about unrefined crude or exploration and production product. And so the majority of those projects will contain BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes, and then total petroleum hydrocarbons. So those are the compounds that we tend to focus on. However, there might be additional chemicals that we want to look for at a site. It's going to be very site specific to the types of operations. If it's just an unrefined crude pipeline rupture, we're probably going to be looking at BTEX and TPH. If it's an active exploration production pad site, we might be looking at metals and other compounds as well. So again, we want to sample delineate all affected media. We want to make sure we're using the adequate sampling methods. I would suggest 5035 as well, EPA for VOCs, TPH. Railroad Commission has adopted those sampling protocols, and so for Railroad Commission sites, we want to make sure we're also using those methods. So when we get into the cleanup phase of the site, we can show that we have representative data that is collected by the approved and established methods. And then with the Railroad Commission, their cleanup process is a little bit different. You're going to be either enrolled in the operator cleanup program, the OCP, or the voluntary cleanup program. The majority of the sites that I've seen fall under the OCP program.
We have a clarification. Somebody in our audience, they said the extension request should be requested prior to the 30-day deadline.
Yes.
If it's requested after, it may not be granted.
That's correct. Sorry. Yes, you obviously want to request the extension within that 30-day window. And so if you're at day 20 and you have 14, 15 days, you definitely want to get that notification in prior to that 30-day deadline. Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Okay, so now
we're right along.
We've assessed. We know where our impacts are, and so we want to remediate those impacts. So how do we do it? So again, it can be dependent on the regulatory agency. Is this a TCQ spills rule project? Is it a Railroad Commission project? Well, under spill rules, we talked about removal of source to the background or pre-existing conditions, and those chemicals of concerns that we've identified. We want to make sure that those specifically have been removed. We confirm those by representative confirmation samples from the soil, or potentially samples from sediment, surface water, and groundwater. Railroad Commission spills, same process. We want to know the chemicals of concern. However, they're more focused. We talked about TPH and BTEX and those additional chemicals of concern. They adopt protective levels and protective limits that are very similar to the TCQ limit. So for BTEX, they're the exact same. If you're used to the Tier 1 residential assessment level, for BTEX are the same values. And for TPH, it's 10,000 parts per million TPH. If you're, for the majority of sites, sometimes you might have a site-specific PCL that you're calculating, but it's 1% by weight TPH, which correlates to 10,000 parts per million TPH. That needs to be cleaned up within the first year. You can be granted extension on that as well. We have had that on several sites, but the BTEX and the COC, additional COCs tend to be a little bit more long-term closure. Sometimes if you're after it, you clean up pretty quickly. You might have BTEX and TPH cleaned up within the first year. Also, other things to consider is who owns the land. Is it a lease land? What does that lease agreement state? Are there additional requirements? You might have a facility that's a Railroad Commission site. You've cleaned up TPH and BTEX to the proper conditions, but your lease agreement states that you need to clean up to pre-existing conditions. Mm-hmm. So those are other things to consider outside of the state agency's requirements.
I can guess it could get a little hairy when you're talking about if you own or lease the land, because who is ultimately responsible would probably be the owner, correct?
It would all be dependent on potentially the contract that was signed between the landowner and the operator. So hopefully you have a good environmental lawyer and you've got some great language in there as the owner or as the operator.
Okay.
So we're talking through this process. We talked about roll-off boxes initially. So we're likely going to have contaminated soils and potentially contaminated liquids. So what do we do with those? We need to remove the source. And so removing soil means we're potentially taking it off-site for disposal. So we have to classify that waste. It needs to be characterized with representative samples. It needs to be profiled, and it needs to go to an approved landfill. And most facilities that are prepared, they will have those facilities identified. We know the location of our site. We know how close those facilities are. So, we're not wasting any time trying to identify those facilities on the fly. And sometimes you have specialty waste that you need to take care of. So PCBs, asbestos, radioactive material, those cannot go to certain, just your normal landfill. They have to go to specialty disposal facilities. They have to be sampled a certain way. They have to be treated a certain way. And they have to be documented a certain way. So we want to make sure that we have those identified ahead of time.
Okay. We do have a comment. Railroad Commission's TPH only 1% by weight in non-sensitive areas, otherwise use TRRP PCLs. Did I say that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. And that'll be under your statewide rules 91 and 8 that identifies sensitive receptors and sensitive areas.
And we got a sharp audience today. They're picking up a lot of stuff. So that's awesome. Okay.
All right. And then, so the remediation process. So we talked about source removal, excavation, disposal. Are there other options? There are. Can you recycle this material? Can you perform land farming on site? Those things are going to take time. They don't happen immediately. When we perform excavation disposal, obviously it's immediate source removal. It's off-site. We can confirm it. If we're talking about land farming, it could take a year. It could take 3 years on site that we mix the soil up and let it see the concentration slowly degrade over time. So we've got those options. They're not, they can take time, whereas the others are immediate. We're performing them within the first couple days. Mm-hmm. Land farming is 2 or 3 years out, so it's not an immediate closure process.
So when you say land farming, exactly what is that process?
You're going to build, so it's kind of like we're building up a berm of soil. It's almost
compost type of, or
so. If I think of it almost like as windrows. If you have a cornfield and you have a berm around the edge of it, you're going to have soil that's impacted. You'll lay a certain base down to where you don't have any leaching of chemicals from the soil. You're going to berm the edges of it, and you maintain it with water, and you kind of stir it up, and it just slowly. Natural attenuation is kind of what we call it if we sit there and let it degrade over time. And so this kind of speeds up the activity a little bit. You'll add some hay to the process, you add some water to the process, and you stir it up. You get a little bit of volatility from the soils.
It's a lot of work, sounds like.
It is, and it's expensive because you have to have a water supply nearby. Not everybody's going to have a water supply nearby, maybe a pipeline that's out in the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
So reporting, regulatory reporting. So we mentioned it earlier, documentation is key. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. We want to know everything from the start to the end of the process. We want to build that chronology with key events that occurred from the identification phase, the total spill volume, who was there, what kind of waste did we have, where did it go, what volume of waste did we have, what was our sampling approach, what were the results, what did the confirmation samples state, and what remediation technologies did we use. All this is going to be combined into one report. Once we identified we've completely removed the source and we're requesting closure, it'll be bundled in a package sent to the state for review and approval. We kind of touched on it already, and I won't touch too much on it, but TCQ, the 30-day status report, if you can clean up within 30 days, that's fantastic. If not, provide that notification before the end of those 30 days. You can be granted up to 180 days for closure. If you can't clean up there, we're moving into likely the corrective action program. And the Railroad Commission can be case-by-case dependent. You go into the OCP or the VCP process. Still requires immediate notification. You still want to start remediating immediately, but can be case-by-case dependent, excuse me. And then there's also internal reporting. So, we have reportable quantities and reportable spills, but does that mean you have to document everything? A lot of our clients like to document every spill, regardless if it's 5 ounces, 5 gallons, 55 gallons, 500 gallons. They want to document that information. So they have that for internal reporting. And while we're going through the process of regulatory reporting, you also want to provide field updates. So daily field reports to the client from what's going on. The site activities are always great to include. provides feedback with what progress has been made on site. Sometimes the client isn't going to be on site, they're going to be remote. So we want to make sure that they're provided those daily updates. And also we might have regulatory agencies that are involved and they want daily updates that or weekly updates.
So sometimes they're required.
I wouldn't say that they are required. I don't think I've seen one where they require us to have daily updates that go to the TCQ Railroad Commission, but the more information you can provide them, the more involved they can be, probably the easier it will be on the closure process. There's also internal financial reporting. Sometimes you get insurance involved in certain spills. And so from a client standpoint, they want to know who was responsible for the spill. Was it a contractor? Was it one of their crew members? And if so, does the insurance policy kick in at some point?
Okay.
And then we talked about it previously, third-party requirements. Are there going to be any requirements for cleanup outside of the TCQ and Railroad Commission requirements? And that would be based off of a general contract with the landowner and potentially the operator.
Wow, we're wrapping up. So
wrapping up.
Let's recap.
So, we want to plan for success. We don't want to plan for failure. So 5 simple steps. Preparation. Make sure that we have the proper personnel in place. They're trained, they're certified, they have gone through a drill, they have some experience. It's going to get you ahead of the curve. When that spill occurs, we want to identify, control, contain, stop that spill. So step 1 and 2, kind of the emergency process. Mm-hmm. Then we move into the spill response. So assessment, what's affected, where is it, what type of chemical is it, how do we sample it, what are we sampling for? Then we have the remediation. How do we clean it up? What standards do we need to clean it up for? Who's the jurisdiction under? Is it TCQ? Is it Railroad Commission? Is it somebody else? GLO, for instance, coastal waters. And then reporting and closure. What's required to complete the report? Establish that chronology. Establish all the information you can. Bring it all together. Wrap it up in one report and request closure. Hopefully you get it done on the first time. Might require some further activities if maybe some things are missed on site. Hopefully not. But last step is get that report to the state within those time frames and close out the sites.
Okay. So I had a really good question. I totally just left. It'll come to, but the audience does have a question. Can you address this? Is it CERCLA?
CERCLA.
CERCLA.
CERCLA. Like Superfund, yes.
Yeah. Could you address the CERCLA petroleum exclusion, please? Don't look at me that way. I didn't come up with this.
I'm not. Can you send that over here so I can take a look at it? Can you adjust the CERCLA petroleum exclusion? Whoever sent that to me, can you send me an email so I can get a little bit more information on that?
Yeah, I'll make sure we answer that. And then, so an earlier question. Aren't there reporting thresholds? What are the, so sorry, that was, and are there any specific Texas thresholds that are more stringent than EPA or unique to Texas?
I mean, you've got those thresholds that are in place that are established for spill rules, TCQ, TERP, cleanup levels. And so some of those are state specific cleanup values. Most of them are, we relate to the EPA region values, but we also have the state dependent values for the TCQ established cleanups, whether it's a residential, commercial, industrial site. We also have our Railroad Commission specific values for cleanup. I talked about those. And so they're very similar values. Some of the state specific values, some of the state specific values are more related to conditions. For instance, metals. Metals have a specific concentration for cleanup in the state of Texas, whereas the EPA may have a defined value that's different than what we have established for the state.
Okay, so this is last question I have. Oh, we have one more. Wow. So how long, if somebody calls you today and says, hey, I want to get a response plan in place, how long is that process? Is it like it's going to take a week? Is it a day job? Or, I mean,
it depends on the facility, right?
Okay.
We want to get in front of the client, sit down, have a meeting, take a look at the facility itself, see what type of materials they have, see what they contain, or they store or use on site. So it's going to be a site visit to make sure we understand their operations, their procedures, what they handle on a day-to-day basis. And, it could be a very small facility. It could be a week. It could be a 2-week process. It could be a month process. It's all going to be dependent on the site and the conditions and what they what they store and contain and use.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming up here. So, okay, when transferring ownership, contaminated land, and when it was agreed between the parties to split remediation measures, who would be responsible for reporting it? The soon-to-be owner or the seller?
Oh boy, that's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Let me see. So you said it to me, so I want to read it here. When transferring ownership containing land. So in regards to it being contaminated, so we're kind of outside the points of a spill. We already know
we're
that
at
it's
remediation at that point, right?
Yeah, we're at remediation at that point. But if it's a spill that has occurred,
it should have been the current
It should have been either the operator. Yeah. So who owns the site or who operates on the site, that should be the responsible party for who needs to report it. And so
the buyer is actually buying the problem
right
at that point. Yeah.
If I was the buyer, I would make sure I have the right lawyer, and I'm not reporting that. It's going to be on the property owner, the responsible party that actually caused the issue.
Okay, so we do have an answer on the circular question. It says I think there's two people. It says 100 pounds for any product or material spilled to water.
There you go.
Okay. And then for TCU spill, i.e. milk, confetti, non-sheen material. So, all right. And then the last question we have here is that somebody has, I own a gas station, and they want to know, do they need to have an SPCC?
Okay. Gas station, well, it's going to depend. So
okay.
It'll depend on the volume. So 42,000 gallons of collective volume below ground storage, and do they have the potential to discharge to navigable water? Okay. So can it go to a lake where we're transporting crude or materials across a ship channel, a lake, a river, any water that's deemed navigable? So potentially that gas station could have an SPCC plan, but it's all going to be dependent on that navigable water.
So you can
body.
have a 42,000 gallon tank or a cumulative $42,000 gallon tank and not need an SPCC if you're not going to impact water?
That's navigable water, right? Wow. So if you have a Buc-ee's that's off of 290 that there's nothing nearby, there's not a creek where we potentially had historic or could potentially have current or future uses of that water body, no, it would not be required.
Wow, that's excellent. Okay, storm drains always go somewhere. That's what somebody's comment was. So, okay, well, that's going to wrap it up for today. Great webinar. Great response. We had
active audience.
Very active audience. I might have broken a record. So, if you do need to contact Austin, here's his contact information, his email and his phone number and his LinkedIn and his picture. Where's the A&M logo? You missed the A&M logo.
I got dropped out there.
My gosh, you're slacking. So if you need to have any questions, you can always send them to me, or Austin. Be more than happy to answer them. Coming up next, our next webinar is we were talking a little bit about hazardous waste, but we're going to do you generate hazardous waste in Texas? Industrial and hazardous waste rules changes. Jennifer Adams and Kyle Artrip is going to be our experts on that one. So we appreciate you guys coming to our webinar. Austin, thank you for joining us, and we know this is your very favorite. And there was a question whether you had a couple of sick kids, or you were either going to be here or not. But
made it happen.
Thank goodness for grandparents. So
there you go.
You guys have a great week, and we will see you next time.